We're asking you to cross the threshold with us, to just leave the comfort of the rational, sunlit world entirely behind.
Right, because we are examining one of the most thoroughly documented, relentlessly terrifying, and frankly deeply polarizing paranormal cases in modern American history.
Exactly. Our mission in this deep dive is to conduct a really uncompromising, clinical and theological expose into the haunting of the Smurl family. We are looking at a house in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, a completely mundane, middle-class duplex that became the site of a supernatural siege from 1974 all the way to 1989.
And we are not approaching this as just a collection of ghost stories. We are treating this as an active case file, relying on a very specific, grim stack of evidence.
Yeah, the primary source here is a detailed video documentary archive. It maps out the visceral day-by-day timeline of the terror on Chase Street.
And we are cross-referencing that primary timeline with secondary historical archives, academic reviews, skeptical inquiries from the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims to the Paranormal, or CSICOP, and the deeply controversial 1986 book, The Haunted.
We have the facts, we have the claims, and we have the counterclaims. So, you, as the listener, you're our fellow investigator on this journey. We're asking you to leave your preconceptions at the door.
Whether you are a staunch believer in the supernatural or a hardened skeptic, we need you to look at the evidence clinically. We are about to descend into profound psychological and spiritual darkness.
To do this properly, we really need a framework. I mean, we can't just list off scary events. We need to understand the alleged mechanics behind them.
Right. To understand the sheer weight of what happened to the Smurl family, we have to establish the theological lens through which this haunting was eventually classified. We'll be using the rigorous demonological framework defined by Ed Lorraine Warren.
And in Roman Catholic demonology, as interpreted by the Warrens, a demonic haunting is not just a random sequence of spooky events. It is a calculated, predatory, military campaign.
Exactly. It operates in 4 distinct, terrifying stages.
So let's unpack those stages for the listener before we dive into the timeline. What exactly are we looking out for?
The first stage is infiltration. This is where the entity infiltrates a location, manipulating the environment to sow confusion, paranoia, and fear. It is actively claiming territory.
Okay, and then it escalates.
It does. The second stage is oppression. This is a massive escalation characterized by direct physical, psychological, and spiritual assaults. The goal here is to break the will of the targets, to exhaust them entirely.
Which leads to the third stage, right? Possession.
Yes, possession is the total authoritative overriding of the human consciousness by the entity. And the final stage, the ultimate goal of the demonic predator, is death.
Throughout this deep dive, we are going to rigidly map the Smurl family's horrifying experiences directly onto this progression. We're examining not just what happened, but why it happened.
We will analyze the tactical methodology of whatever unseen force occupied their home.
So let's begin at the beginning, the slow burn, the stage of infestation. The year is 1973, and I want you to picture the setting.
West Pittston, Pennsylvania. A quiet, working-class neighborhood.
It's crucial that we look closely at the targets themselves, because, as we'll learn, in demonology, the victims are never chosen by accident.
No, they aren't. And Jack and Janet Smurl are the absolute picture of the idyllic, traditional American family.
Right. Jack is a Navy veteran. He's a man of intense discipline who works as a neuropsychiatric technician. He's grounded in science, medicine, and order.
And Janet is a devoted, loving mother. But foundational to both of them is their faith. They are deeply devout, practicing Roman Catholics.
Their religion isn't just a Sunday obligation for them. It is the absolute bedrock of their entire lives.
That foundation is incredibly important to keep in mind. Now, in 1972, their previous home was utterly devastated by Hurricane Agnes.
That forced them to relocate, to completely start over.
By the autumn of 1973, Jack's parents, John and Mary Smurl, purchased a double-block duplex on Chase Street for $18,000. It's an older home, built back in 1896.
But for the Smurls, it represents a fresh start, a sanctuary. John and Mary move into the right half of the duplex, while Jack, Janet, and their first 2 daughters, Dawn and Heather, take the left half.
And for the first 18 months, it really is a sanctuary. The archives paint a picture of a family happily settling in. They remodel the house, they redecorate.
They're enjoying this close-knit, multi-generational living arrangement. It is, by all accounts, a profoundly happy home. There is no dark history they're aware of, no dabbling in the occult. It's just a family living their lives.
But then, those 18 months of peace expire.
And that idyllic period serves as a crucial baseline for our investigation.
When we study the substage of what demonologists call encroachment, We see that entities rarely, if ever, strike with full force immediately. It would be tactically foolish.
Instead, they test the perimeter. They test the boundaries of their victim's reality and their capacity for rationalization. In January 1974, the first anomaly occurs.
And what's fascinating here is how deceptively mundane it is.
Right, it's not a floating specter, it's a stain. A mysterious, dark stain that suddenly appears on their brand new carpet.
Imagine you're Jack or Janet. You've just spent money fixing up this house. A stain appears. To any normal homeowner, this is just a profound annoyance.
You blame it on a spilled drink, maybe a leaky roof or an animal. You scrub it and you move on. But it doesn't stop there. The anomalies begin to escalate, cleverly hiding behind the mask of mechanical failure.
Exactly. The entity is exploiting the rational mind's desperate tendency to find logical explanations. Jack's television set spontaneously bursts into flames.
That is terrifying, but a logical mind says faulty wiring, old components.
Then the water pipes begin to leak relentlessly. Now, remember Jack's background. He's a disciplined technician. He goes into the walls and he repeatedly solders these pipes himself.
He knows the job is done right.
And yet, the leaks persist. They actively defy basic plumbing mechanics.
It's a war of attrition on Jack's logic. I mean, if you fix a pipe perfectly and it leaks again the next day, you start to question your own competence, your own memory.
And that is the absolute essence of encroachment. It normalizes the bizarre. It slowly, almost imperceptibly, raises the baseline of anxiety within the home.
It acclimates the entire family to a low-level, constant hum of stress.
Over months and years, this constant underlying tension gradually lowers their spiritual and psychological defenses. They are so busy fighting mundane fires, literally and figuratively, that they don't realize the house itself is turning against them.
But those rationalizations finally begin to falter when the mechanical failures give way to physical, animalistic evidence.
This detail from the documentary archive always chills me.
The Smurls had recently remodeled their bathroom. They put in a brand new sink and a pristine new bathtub. One morning, they walk into that bathroom to find the new porcelain severely scratched.
And we aren't talking about light scuffs. These were deep, violent gouges.
As if a large, wild animal had been trapped in the room, clawing frantically to get out.
The shift from mechanical to physical is the threshold moment. The freshly painted woodwork in the bathroom exhibited the exact same savage scratch marks.
Imagine the profound unease this causes. You can blame a leaking pipe on bad soldering or a TV fire on a bad capacitor, but you cannot rationally explain deep, feral claw marks appearing overnight in a locked, empty bathroom.
What does a logical man like Jack Smurl tell himself in that moment? His reality is beginning to fracture.
And it is right here, between 1974 and 1977, that the haunting shifts gears again. It moves from environmental damage to direct sensory manipulation.
The sensory manipulation phase is where the entity begins to actively and aggressively erode the family's sense of safety and isolation. According to the source archives, the Smurls began to report strange, sour smells filling the house.
I want to be clear about this for you listening. This was not the smell of an old house settling or a damp basement. This was the distinct, vile, overpowering odor of rotting flesh.
Or raw sewage. In demonological literature, this olfactory phenomenon is a classic, almost ubiquitous hallmark of a malevolent, non-human presence.
And it wasn't just the smells. The auditory phenomena escalated rapidly. The family would be sitting in the living room and hear the distinct, heavy sound of footsteps pacing up and down the empty stairs.
Drawers in the kitchen and the bedrooms would violently slide open and slam shut when absolutely no one was in the room.
Radios that Jack had physically unplugged from the wall, literally severing their connection to a power source, would suddenly blare into the dead of night.
They're being subjected to chronic hypervigilance. Outside, on the empty porch, the heavy wooden chairs would begin to rock and creak, as if occupied by invisible guests watching the house.
This constant, unpredictable bombardment of the senses is a documented tactic designed to induce severe sleep deprivation.
The family is actively being taught that their own senses cannot be trusted, and that their home, their sanctuary, is occupied.
And then the phenomena crosses a terrifying new threshold. It moves from the auditory and olfactory into the visual and tactile.
In 1975, the eldest daughter, Dawn, begins experiencing horrific visions.
She repeatedly reports seeing people, literal, full-bodied human figures, just floating around her bedroom.
Around this exact same time, Jack Smurl begins to report feeling ghostly caresses. The distinct, undeniable physical touch of an unseen hand running over his body.
The physical touching is a severe escalation within the infestation stage. It proves that the entity is not just generating illusions.
Right, it can interact with the physical space and the physical bodies of the inhabitants.
By 1977, the family has grown. They've welcomed two more children, the twins, Shannon and Karen. But as the family grows, so does the darkness in the house.
Toilets flush on their own. The environment is becoming openly, undeniably hostile.
The slow burn of infestation has completed its primary objective. The Smurls know, without a shadow of a doubt, that they are living with something unnatural.
Yet, remarkably, they tolerate it. They try to live their lives, hoping it will fade. They don't immediately flee.
Which is a common and tragic psychological response. We must pause here to analyze the theological mechanics of what has just occurred over the course of the 1970s.
The family has survived a decade of low-level supernatural harassment. From a psychological standpoint, they have completely normalized the abnormal. They've adapted to living in a war zone.
But from a demonological standpoint, the entity has successfully integrated itself into the energetic and spiritual fabric of the household.
It's been feeding. It has fed on the ambient anxiety. It has fed on the minor arguments caused by sleep deprivation.
It has gorged itself on the latent fear of the children.
It has gathered immense strength over a decade. Infestation is entirely about claiming territory and softening the targets. The territory has now been claimed.
By the early 1980s, the entity is prepared to move to the second stage of the Warrens' framework, oppression.
The goal of oppression is not merely to frighten. The goal is to systematically, violently dismantle the victim's physical health, their psychological stability, and most importantly, their faith.
It is a calculated campaign of active, targeted terror. And that transition from mere annoyance to active, visceral terror happens with brutal suddenness in February of 1985.
I want to walk you through this escalation because the archives describe it so vividly.
Janet Smurl is alone in the basement. She's just doing laundry, the most mundane, everyday task imaginable. Suddenly, she hears her name called out.
Janet. Clear, distinct, echoing in the empty subterranean room.
She stops. She searches the basement, she searches the entire house, but she is entirely alone.
Auditory targeting. It is isolating her, making her realize that it knows exactly who she is.
2 days later, the physical environment of the house violently shifts. The temperature in the duplex plummets. It becomes unnaturally icy cold.
The sources describe it as a cold that seems to bypass the skin and seep directly into the bones.
And then the entity finally manifests in plain sight. Janet is standing in her kitchen when a dark, human-shaped form materializes.
It is about 5 feet 9 inches tall. It is a solid, dense mass of blackness, completely devoid of any facial features.
It just stands there, projecting an aura of absolute paralyzing menace. And then it simply dematerializes. It slips straight through the solid kitchen wall.
And here's where the corroboration comes in.
Right. Moments later, on the exact other side of the duplex, Mary Smurl-Jack's mother witnesses the exact same featureless black entity appear in her space.
This visual manifestation is a critical clinical escalation. By presenting itself as a cohesive, localized form to multiple witnesses simultaneously, the entity is dropping the pretense of being a mere poltergeist or a trick of the old wiring.
It is presenting itself as an intelligent, autonomous, imposing force.
Furthermore, that sudden icy cold that accompanied the manifestation is frequently reported in deep-stage hauntings. It is theoretically the result of the entity drawing immense amounts of thermal energy from the ambient environment.
In order to generate the energy required to manifest physically.
Exactly. Once it has achieved this ability to physically interact with the space, the physical assaults begin. The oppression stage relies on breaking the physical boundaries of the victims. It needs to prove to them that their bodies are just as vulnerable as their drywall.
And the clinical breakdown of these physical assaults, as detailed in the documentary archives, is truly harrowing. We are no longer talking about scratched bathtubs. We are talking about targeted strikes that could easily be classified as attempted murder.
Let's look at the night before 13-year-old Heather's Catholic confirmation.
Now, this is a deeply significant, holy milestone for a devout Catholic family. On the eve of this sacrament, a massive ceiling light fixture in the kitchen suddenly detaches and crashes down.
It narrowly misses 13-year-old Shannon, the twin. It nearly kills her.
This is not a structural accident. From a demonological perspective, this is a highly calculated, targeted strike.
Designed to ruin a holy sacrament and associate a sacred day with near-lethal trauma.
Following this, the fundamental laws of physics within the house seem to break down entirely. Jack Smurl is physically levitated from his bed, hovering helplessly in the air.
And it isn't just the humans who are targeted. The family's 75-pound German shepherd, Simon, becomes a primary victim.
Simon is a large, powerful, protective animal.
Yep.
Yet this dog is repeatedly picked up by an unseen force, violently thrown across the room, and physically whipped.
Simon is terrorized to the point where he refuses to leave the hallway. He desperately tries to guard the children's bedroom door, instinctively knowing they are in danger, but even he is completely defenseless against what is in that house.
The abuse of the family pet is one of the most insidious tactics in the oppression playbook.
A dog represents protection. It represents loyalty, unconditional love, and an early warning system for the physical perimeter of the family.
By brutalizing the dog, the entity accomplishes two things. It demonstrates its overwhelming dominant power, and it strips away the family's last line of mundane earthly defense.
It tells him, your protector is my plaything.
But the violence doesn't stop with the animal. The entity begins to target the marital bond, which, in the Catholic family structure, is the most sacred human relationship.
The sources detail a horrific night in June. Jack and Janet have just been intimate. As they lie in bed, vulnerable and relaxed, Janet is violently grabbed by an unseen force and hurled completely off the mattress.
Jack immediately attempts to intervene to protect his wife, but he is instantly paralyzed. He is locked inside his own body, unable to move a muscle, while the bedroom rapidly fills with that gagging, putrid odor of rotting meat.
This is a classic, documented demonological strategy. Attacking the couple in their most vulnerable, intimate moments serves to fundamentally associate marital love and physical intimacy with trauma, powerlessness, and fear.
It is designed to drive a wedge between the spouses, to make them afraid of each other and of their shared space.
And this leads us to what is undoubtedly the darkest, most disturbing aspect of the oppression stage: the sexual assault and the deliberate, systematic breaking of the family's will.
We must treat this section with extreme clinical gravity, as these are the most traumatic and deeply invasive claims in the entire case file.
To understand how these assaults were possible, we must look at the groundwork the entity laid. It utilized a strategy of severe, prolonged sleep deprivation.
The archives describe the beds shaking violently through the night, phantom dogs running up and down the halls,
The sound of invisible snakes hissing in the absolute darkness of the bedrooms, the heavy booted footsteps crossing the attic overhead.
The family physically cannot sleep. They are running on empty. They're exhausted, terrified, and psychologically brittle.
It is precisely in this weakened, defenseless state that the entity launches its most vile, transgressive attacks.
Jack Smurl reports being paralyzed in his bed, fully conscious but unable to move, and being sexually assaulted by a demonic entity known in theology as a succubus.
He describes this entity in horrifying, visceral detail. It was a scaly creature that possessed the body of a young woman, but when he looked at its face, it was the visage of an ancient, decaying hag with glowing red eyes and green, rotting gums.
And Janet is similarly targeted. She reports being sexually assaulted by an incubus, an invisible, crushing weight that pins her down, attacking her and choking her by the throat until her vision literally goes black.
From a clinical standpoint, whether an investigator views these events as literal physical demonic assaults or as profound waking psychological manifestations brought on by extreme, prolonged stress and sleep deprivation, the intended outcome of the oppressor is exactly the same.
The complete degradation of the human spirit.
In demonology, the incubus and succubus are not merely sexual predators, they are mechanisms for profound spiritual defilement. By violating Jack and Janet, the entity is asserting ultimate dominance over their physical bodies, their bodily autonomy, and their dignity.
It's about humiliation. It's about breaking them down to nothing.
Precisely. And this leads directly into the substage of psychological isolation. The Smurls are living in an active war zone, but to the outside world, Chase Street looks perfectly normal.
That's the maddening part. The archives note that neighbors living nearby actually heard the blood-curdling screams. They heard the massive banging on the walls, the animalistic grunts coming from the house.
But the Smurls felt utterly, profoundly alone. They reach out to their local diocese in Scranton, desperately seeking help, seeking intervention.
But the church was hesitant. They moved slowly. The local priests were skeptical of the claims, offering basic blessings that seemed only to anger the entity and trigger worse retaliation.
This bureaucratic hesitation left the family feeling abandoned by the very faith they relied upon for protection.
And this isolation was not just a circumstantial byproduct of the church's bureaucracy. It was actively engineered by the entity through a process known as spiritual deception.
Yes, the story of Father O'Leary. This is devastating.
Janet, who is desperate for salvation and feeling ignored by her diocese, believes she has finally found an ally. She is getting help from a compassionate priest who introduces himself as Father O'Leary.
She confides in him. She seeks his spiritual counsel. She believes with all her heart that he is her lifeline back to the grace of the church.
And then the reality sets in.
Right. It was later discovered, to Janet's absolute soul-crushing horror, that Father O'Leary did not exist. There's absolutely no record of him in the diocese.
The entity had been impersonating a priest. It had offered her a false beacon of hope, only to brutally rip it away.
It proved to Janet that it could manipulate her reality, disguise itself as the holy, and actively mock her desperate need for spiritual intervention.
The mockery of the holy is a crucial diagnostic indicator, and this mocking became incredibly blatant as the oppression stage peaked.
Inside the walls of the home, resounding through the plaster and wood, the family began to hear the undeniable, terrifying sounds of pigs squealing.
Why pigs? Why is that specific sound so important?
The sound of pigs squealing is a deeply significant detail in Roman Catholic demonology. It is considered a classic, undeniable sign of a powerful, entrenched infestation.
Thematically, it is a direct, blasphemous mockery of the Holy Trinity.
It is heavily associated with the biblical account in the Gospel of Mark, where Christ casts the legion of demons out of a possessed man and into a herd of swine, which then rush off a cliff.
By producing this specific sound, the entity is not just trying to scare the family with a loud noise, it is making a theological statement.
It is declaring its non-human nature, flaunting its power, and explicitly, arrogantly mocking the religious beliefs of the household.
It's taunting them. It's at this point, with the family physically broken, socially isolated, and under constant physical and spiritual assault, that they realize they cannot fight this alone.
The local church is too slow. They need specialized, immediate help. And so we enter the crisis, the stage of possession.
The year is 1986. The Smurls, having exhausted their local options, reach out to the secular world of paranormal investigation. Enter Ed and Lorraine Warren, alongside a registered nurse and psychic named Rosemary Frew.
Now, the Warrens are absolute veterans of the supernatural. They step onto Chase Street and immediately take charge of the investigation.
They conduct an initial sweep of the duplex, and they identify the bedroom closet as the supernatural nexus, the crossover point between the two sides of the duplex.
During this sweep, Lorraine and Rosemary identify not one, but 4 distinct spirits occupying the home.
The identification of the entities is fascinating. First, there's Abigail, who is described as a confused, earthbound spirit of an old woman.
Second, there is Patrick, described as a dark, mustachioed man who, according to psychic impressions, allegedly murdered his wife and her lover before being hanged by a mob.
Third, there is a violent, insane woman who actively seeks to cause harm. And finally, there is the fourth entity, the Puppet Master.
The controlling, malignant demon that has infested the very walls of the house.
How does a demonologist explain 4 different entities living in a duplex? Do they work together?
The identification of multiple human spirits alongside a demonic entity is a very complex dynamic. The Warrens theorized that the demon, being an entity of pure malice, uses these trapped human spirits as camouflage.
Or, more sinisterly, it enslaves them, using their residual energy to fuel its own manifestations and keeping them bound to the property as part of its localized power structure.
The Warrens also noted something very important right away. The Smurls did not fit the typical profile of a haunted family. They hadn't dabbled in the occult. They hadn't used a Ouija board at a party.
There was no history of substance abuse or deep, fractured family discord. They were a loving, devout family. So how did this happen?
Ed Warren concludes that the demon must have been dormant in the land or the house for decades. It was awakened, he theorized, by drawing on the immense emotional and biological energy generated by the Smurl daughters entering puberty.
He viewed that developmental stage as a massive source of kinetic psychic energy that acted like a battery for the dormant entity.
With that diagnosis made, Ed Warren makes a highly controversial and incredibly dangerous tactical decision. He decides he cannot wait for the entity to act. He must force its hand.
He decides to engage in religious provocation.
Let's talk about this provocation tactic, because it sounds like throwing a grenade into a hornet's nest.
Ed Warren's strategy is a deliberate attempt to force the demon out of the shadows and into the open. He wants to compel it to show itself so it can be fought directly.
So, he begins playing tape recordings of religious music, specifically the Ave Maria, at high volume. He walks through the house, loudly reciting prayers.
The reaction from the entity is instantaneous and incredibly violent. The heavy bedroom mirrors begin to shake violently against the walls, threatening to shatter.
A small, portable television set, which was completely unplugged from the wall, suddenly clicks on. It emits an eerie, silvery white glow.
Through the static, the family swears they can see shadowy figures looking back at them through the screen.
The manipulation of electronics, even when disconnected from a power source, is a massive display of energy.
And then, the demon leaves a direct, physical message, written on the glass of the mirror, spelling out a vile threat for Ed Warren. "You filthy bastard, get out of this house."
The provocation culminates in a physical attack on Ed himself. He is choked by an unseen force to the point of near unconsciousness.
Immediately following this, he suffers a sudden, crippling onset of severe flu-like symptoms, forcing him to retreat.
Ed Warren's tactic of provocation is highly debated, even within demonological circles. Many argue it is reckless, as it almost always dramatically accelerates the danger to the family.
But from his perspective, it serves a vital diagnostic purpose. It conclusively confirms the presence of a non-human intelligence that aggressively, violently reacts to the holy.
This brings us to a crucial analytical point in this deep dive: the theology of the oppressed. We must ask the question, why was Jack Smurl specifically targeted for the most horrific abuse?
Why was the patriarch repeatedly subjected to paralysis, levitation, and sexual violation by a succubus?
From a theological perspective, the entity is employing a strict military strategy. Jack is the father. He's the Navy veteran, the physical protector, and the spiritual leader of the home.
By systematically dismantling the patriarch, by stripping him of his physical power, his bodily dignity, and his ability to protect his wife and children, the entity shatters the foundational faith and security of the entire family unit.
If you destroy the strongest pillar, the entire house collapses.
That is the demonological perspective. But as we promised at the start, we must maintain impartiality and examine this case from all angles.
While the Warrens viewed Jack as a spiritual target, the skeptics viewed him through a purely clinical, medical lens. Paul Kurtz, the chairman of CSI COP, launched his own intensive inquiry into the case.
Kurtz pointed out a highly significant, undeniable medical detail that cannot be ignored. In 1983, right in the middle of the escalating haunting, Jack Smurl underwent brain surgery.
He had an operation to remove water from his brain, which was a late complication from a severe case of meningitis he suffered in his youth.
That is a massive physiological trauma.
Exactly. Kurtz suggested that Jack's horrific visions of the succubus, the levitations, the memory loss, and the paralysis were not the work of an ancient demon, but the tragic, understandable results of delusions, hallucinations, or brain impairment stemming from this major neurological event.
He argued that the extreme stress of the household, combined with the patriarch suffering from neurological trauma, caused a state of mass psychological contagion among the rest of the family. They saw what Jack saw because they were terrified and desperate.
It is a vital and incredibly compelling counterargument. The skeptical view rightfully demands that we look for parsimonious, mundane explanations before jumping straight to the supernatural.
However, what is fascinating is how the demonological perspective responds to this. It does not necessarily dismiss Jack's medical history. Rather, it completely incorporates it into the framework.
In the theology of the paranormal, physical vulnerability, neurological trauma, and extreme psychological stress are not just symptoms of a medical issue. They are spiritual gateways.
An entity seeking to oppress a family will look for and exploit any existing crack in the armor.
If Jack's brain surgery left him neurologically vulnerable, a demonic intelligence would view that not as a coincidence, but as an open door.
It would target him precisely because his biological defenses were weakened, using his medical trauma as a beachhead to launch its assault on his reality.
That is a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
That your medical vulnerabilities make you a target.
Regardless of the underlying cause, whether neurological contagion or demonic siege, the reality for the Smurls was that the situation was critical. The local diocese was still dragging its feet, analyzing the evidence.
So the Warrens decided to bypass them. They brought in their own heavy artillery. They called in Bishop Robert McKenna.
Bishop McKenna is a fascinating figure in this history. He was a traditionalist Catholic priest from Connecticut.
He was a man who vehemently refused to abide by the modernizing changes of the Second Vatican Council. He insisted on saying the Mass in the ancient Latin, believing the older rites had more spiritual authority.
And he was an absolute veteran of the spiritual battlefield, having performed over 50 exorcisms alongside the Warrens.
McKenna arrives at Chase Street, prepared for war. He is there to perform the ancient, rigorous rite of exorcism.
He conducts the ritual, speaking the ancient Latin commands, demanding the entity leave the premises and release the family. And the result? It is an absolute catastrophic failure.
The failure of an exorcism is a profoundly dangerous moment in any case file. It tells the entity that the spiritual authority brought against it is insufficient.
It emboldens the oppressor, and it almost always results in brutal, immediate retaliation against the victims.
The demon, infuriated by McKenna's Latin rites and the attempt to expel it, strikes back at the family with unprecedented ferocity. The phenomena move rapidly from oppression to the very edges of possession.
The retaliation is swift, and it is sickening. The Smurl's young daughter, Karen, suddenly falls deathly ill. She is struck with a mysterious raging fever that spikes so high she nearly dies.
Physical violence against the women in the house escalates dramatically. Deep, unexplained slash marks and bite wounds spontaneously appear on the arms and bodies of both Janet and Mary Smurl.
And Jack is subjected to a truly monstrous vision. Following the failed exorcism, the entity appears to Jack not as a shattered, but as a grotesque, fully formed physical apparition of a massive, two-legged pig creature.
The pig imagery returns, reinforcing the mockery of the holy, but now it is physically manifested.
The horror is absolute. The family realizes that the traditional rites of the church, performed by a veteran bishop, have completely failed them.
They are trapped in a house with an entity that has just defeated a bishop. They are desperate. And in a last-ditch effort to force the hand of the Catholic Church hierarchy, the Smurls decide to do the unthinkable. They go to the media.
This is a massive turning point in the timeline. Historically, families experiencing genuine hauntings avoid the press at all costs.
They fear ridicule, they fear losing their jobs, they fear the social stigma. But the Smurls, feeling totally abandoned by their diocese, decide to weaponize public attention.
They appear anonymously, hidden behind a screen to protect their identities, on a Philadelphia television talk show called People Are Talking, hosted by Richard Bay.
Their strategic goal is simple: generate enough public outcry that the Bishop of Scranton will be politically and morally forced to authorize a higher-level intervention.
But they underestimate the entity's reaction. To the demon, this broadcast is an act of supreme defiance. They have taken the secret of the infestation and broadcast it to the world.
The demon's punishment for this media appearance is immediate and physically devastating.
Upon returning home from the television studio, expecting perhaps some relief, the entity launches a full-scale assault.
Janet Smurl is physically levitated into the air and violently hurled across the room, smashing into the wall.
As she lies in bed, battered and terrified, a grotesque physical human hand rises up straight through the solid mattress and violently grabs her by the back of the neck.
Jack is once again paralyzed and subjected to yet another horrific sexual assault.
The entity is making a clear, unmistakable statement. There is no escape, and every attempt to seek outside help will be met with escalating, unbearable pain.
The crisis has reached a boiling point, and this brings us to the final chilling stage of our deep dive, the aftermath, and the terrifying concept of vexation.
Vexation is perhaps the most despair-inducing realization a victim can have. It is the realization that the haunting is no longer localized to the geography of the home.
The entity has attached itself not to the wood and plaster of Chase Street, but to the energetic signatures of the family members themselves.
Desperate for just one night of reprieve from the relentless violence, Jack and Janet pack up the family and flee. They drive away from West Pittston, seeking refuge at a campground in the Poconos.
They hope that distance, just putting miles between them and the duplex, will break the cycle.
But the sanctuary of the woods offers no protection because they brought the infection with them.
While at the campsite, miles away from the duplex, the terror follows them in broad daylight. The heavy metal trash cans at the campground begin to spin violently on their own.
As the family sits in the darkness around the camp, they hear the distinct, haunting voices of the entities echoing through the trees, taunting them.
It is a moment of profound, crushing despair. They realize they cannot simply move away. The demon is with them. It has infected their lives, their very energetic perimeter.
Defeated, they are forced to return to Chase Street, to a home that is no longer a home, but a cage.
And upon their return, the consequences of their media strategy explode into a full-blown circus. In August of 1986, realizing anonymity is useless, the Smurls drop their shield and grant a full-named interview to the Wilkes-Barre Sunday Independent.
The story goes national. Almost overnight, the quiet neighborhood of Chase Street becomes ground zero for a mass media frenzy.
The sources state that up to 90 reporters a day descend on the neighborhood. The street is constantly clogged with news vans, satellite dishes, curious onlookers, paranormal thrill seekers,
Yeah.
and hardened skeptics.
The quiet, isolating terror of the Smurl home is instantly replaced by the blinding, chaotic glare of television cameras.
And it is here that the skeptics launch their heaviest counteroffensive. CSI cop investigators, led by Paul Kurtz, attempt to access the house to conduct a scientific evaluation.
But they are repeatedly denied entry by the Warrens and the family. The Smurls fear that skeptical provocation will only anger the demon further.
Denied entry, Kurtz goes on the offensive in the press. He proposes entirely mundane, structural, and psychological explanations for the horror. Let's look at his arguments, because they are grounded in the reality of the region.
He points out that West Pittston sits directly over a vast network of abandoned coal mine voids.
A very common geographical reality in Pennsylvania.
Right. Kurtz argues that the sudden geological settling of these mine voids could easily cause the house to shift rapidly. This shifting would snap soldered pipes, shake walls, and create the terrible banging and rapping noises.
He also suggests that a broken municipal sewer pipe under the property is the obvious source of the vile, rotting smells.
He theorizes that the floating figures and shadows are simply the cruel pranks of local teenagers exploiting the family's known paranoia. He points to the glaring lack of official police records documenting any assaults.
And finally, he loudly questions the family's financial motives, noting to the press that talk of book deals, movie rights, and Hollywood adaptations began circulating almost immediately after the story broke nationally.
We have to acknowledge that the skeptical arguments are robust. They successfully ground the phenomena in the physical, verifiable world. The mine subsidence theory perfectly explains the physical shaking and the plumbing failures that plagued Jack.
The sewer gas explains the putrid smells, and crucially, prolonged exposure to sewer gas could even contribute to severe headaches, nausea, and hallucinations.
And the financial motive is always a powerful psychological driver in high-profile cases. The Smurls, for their part, vehemently denied any interest in money, stating repeatedly that they only wanted spiritual help.
But the media frenzy introduces a completely new, highly theoretical, and deeply chilling concept to this case. As we reviewed the broader archives, we came across a theory that attempts to explain the escalation.
I want to ask you about this because it blew my mind. The egregore theory. Explain to the listener what an egregore is.
An egregore is an occult and philosophical concept. It describes a non-physical entity, a thought form, that arises from the collective, focused consciousness of a large group of people.
Essentially, if enough people believe in something, focus their fear and attention on it, they can inadvertently generate enough psychic energy to give that thought form autonomy and power.
So applying this to the Smurls, the theory proposes a terrifying question. Did the massive public attention, the countrywide television broadcasts, and the collective fear generated by millions of people reading and watching the Smurl story inadvertently create or empower an egregore?
Think about the math here. 90 reporters a day, millions of viewers watching Richard Bay. An entire nation focused on the demonic horror happening in a duplex in Pennsylvania.
Did the entity, which initially fed on the isolated front of a family of 6, suddenly find itself gorging on the psychic energy of a nationwide audience? Did broadcasting the trauma make the demon infinitely more powerful?
It is a profound philosophical question that bridges the gap between mass psychology and the paranormal. If belief and attention are literal forms of energy, then inviting a media circus into a haunting is the equivalent of pouring aviation fuel on a spiritual fire.
The entity, whether it was originally a traditional demon, a localized psychological manifestation, or a newly formed egregore birthed by the press, became incredibly entrenched and infinitely more dangerous.
But the pressure from the press, however dangerous, finally achieved what the Smurls had desperately hoped for. It forced the hand of the Catholic Church.
The Scranton Diocese, deeply embarrassed and heavily pressured by the relentless daily media coverage portraying them as inactive, reluctantly offered to take over the investigation from the Warrens.
In September of 1986, Bishop McKenna returns. But this time, he is not attempting a solo exorcism. The Warrens have orchestrated a massive, coordinated spiritual counteroffensive.
While McKenna conducts the third exorcism rites inside the house, mass prayer groups are gathered both inside the duplex and across external locations. They are actively focusing their collective energetic and spiritual will on ridding the home of the evil.
And for the first time in a decade, it seems to work. The intense, focused spiritual intervention buys the family a reprieve. The banging stops, the rotting smells dissipate, the violent physical attacks cease.
For 3 quiet months, The Smurls experience the peace they have not known since 1974.
But the peace is a fragile, temporary illusion. Just days before Christmas, in December of 1986, Jack Smurl is alone in his living room. He turns off the television, preparing to go to bed in his quiet house.
And there, standing silently in the shadows of the room, is the black, featureless form. The demon has returned.
It stands there, beckoning him toward the final stage possession. Jack clutches his rosary, desperately praying it is an isolated echo of the past. It is not.
The heavy banging resumes in the walls. The putrid smells return to the kitchen. The cycle of violent physical assaults restarts.
The exorcisms, the mass prayers, the media attention, none of it had truly broken the entity's hold.
The crushing realization that the demons simply could not be defeated within that specific geography finally broke their resolve to stay. In 1988, immediately before the publication of Robert Kern's book The Haunted, which chronicled their entire nightmare, Jack and Janet Smurl packed up their family and permanently abandoned the duplex on Chase Street.
They moved to another town in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania.
But as we discussed with vexation, the story does not end with a simple move. Because the entity was attached to their energetic signatures, the Catholic Church recognized that a mere geographical relocation was insufficient.
The historical timeline concludes with an intervention from the absolute pinnacle of the Catholic hierarchy. The case files from Scranton were eventually forwarded to the Vatican.
Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the theologian who would later become Pope Benedict VI, personally reviewed the terrifying evidence of the Smurl case.
The Vatican recognized the severe systemic nature of the spiritual infection. They bypassed the local diocese entirely and dispatched a specialized Vatican-level exorcist.
In 1989, under the direct authority granted by Pope John Paul II, a full, comprehensive exorcism was performed not just on a building, but on the entire Smurl family.
And it was only then, 15 years after the first mysterious stain appeared on their new carpet, that the Smurls finally found lasting, permanent peace. The entity was, at last, formally banished by the highest spiritual authority available to them.
The postscript to this case is just as fascinating as the haunting itself. Following the Smurls' desperate departure, a woman named Deborah Owens moved into the former left half of the duplex on Chase Street. She reported living there for years without ever experiencing a single supernatural occurrence.
Which starkly, undeniably reinforces the vexation theory. The demon was never truly haunting the wood, plaster, and nails of Chase Street. It was hunting the Smurls.
Jack Smurl lived a quiet, devout life afterward. He worked for Topps Chewing Gum for 30 years, remaining highly active in his church until his passing in 2017. The girls grew up, they moved on, becoming teachers, social workers, and health professionals. They survived the absolute crucible of the paranormal.
We have tracked this case from the slow, agonizing, seemingly mundane encroachment of a mysterious stain to a Vatican-sanctioned exorcism orchestrated by future popes.
We have looked at the brutal, clinical reality of the oppression stage, the horrific physical and sexual assaults, the specific theological targeting of the patriarch, and we've weighed the robust, grounded arguments of the skeptics who saw families suffering from severe neurological trauma, mind subsidence, and environmental hazards rather than demonic forces.
We have presented the facts, the claims, and the theories exactly as they exist in the archives.
What remains, regardless of your personal belief in the supernatural, is the profound psychological and spiritual footprint this case leaves behind. It forces every investigator to confront the utter fragility of our own sanctuaries, the limits of our rational explanations, and the terrifying possibility that some forces, whether born from the earth, the human mind, or the depths of hell, operate on a frequency of pure malice, feeding on the very terror they inspire.
Which brings us to a final, dark thought to leave you with, our fellow investigator. Throughout this deep dive, we have continuously discussed the Smurls' unwavering bedrock Catholic faith. It was their shield, it was their comfort, and ultimately, it was the catalyst for their salvation by the Vatican.
But consider the nature of a predator hunting in the dark. A predator is drawn to warmth. It is drawn to a beacon.
If the Smurls' intense, burning faith was a blinding light in the spiritual realm, could that very devotion have been the beacon that attracted such profound, ancient darkness to their doorstep in the first place?
And looking at our world today, an era where we actively broadcast our deepest fears, our traumas, and our anxieties to millions of strangers on digital screens every single day. Are we simply seeking human connection, or are we collectively feeding a massive egregore of our own making?
Are we starving our personal demons, or are we giving them a global audience to feed upon? Keep your spiritual boundaries strong, whatever they may be. We are closing the file on the Smurl haunting. Stay safe in the dark.